So the seminar is part of a series with the general title, Achieving Change for Population and Planetary Health Post-Pandemic. The particular concern of this seminar will be public participation and the ways that digital technology can enable greater public engagement in the identification of problems and in the commitment to action. We're very fortunate to have with us Audrey Tang, Digital Minister of Taiwan, and Geoff Mulgan, Professor of Collective Intelligence, Public Policy and Social Innovation at University College London. It would not, I think, be possible to find two people better equipped to discuss the challenges involved. Both have thought hard about the area, and both have led initiatives with significant impact in government and society. Audrey Tang was first widely known for her contributions to the open source movement and became involved in politics during Taiwan's 2014 Sunflower Student Movement demonstrations, in which Audrey helped the protesters that were occupying the Taiwanese parliament to broadcast their message. The Prime Minister's enlightened response was to invite Audrey to build a media literacy curriculum for Taiwan's schools. Audrey became Minister without Portfolio for Digital Affairs in 2016, in charge of helping government agencies communicate policy goals and managing information published by the government. Audrey's first initiative, the Gov project, Gov spelt G0V, its aim was to make more accessible and interactive versions of various governmental websites. The project was open source and very popular, accessed millions of times each month. Another initiative used social media paradigms for citizens to create digital petitions. The Taiwanese parliament complained that citizens had better access to influence regulation than they did as legislators. That to me is an example where a complaint is the most compelling evidence of success. More recently, mask rationing and contact tracing have been just two of the ways that open data, transparent governance and trust have contributed to Taiwan's highly functional COVID response. Geoff Mulgan has had an exciting and varied career. He founded the think tank Demos, was director of the government's strategy unit and head of policy in the Prime Minister's office under Tony Blair, was the first chief executive of the Young Foundation and served for 9 years as chief executive of Nesta, the UK's innovation foundation. He has advised governments around the world and written a number of books on social innovation, collective intelligence and public strategy. He was knighted in 2020 for services to the creative economy. Geoff has written on the importance of knowledge and data infrastructures for the Paris Agreement on climate change to be implemented, a topic that resonates with the ideas of Charlie Kennel, the founder and funder of the Christ's Climate Seminars. But perhaps more relevant for today's discussion is his book on Big Mind on collective intelligence. In it, Geoff describes how digital technologies make it possible for organizations and societies to think at large scale, and is optimistic about the prospects for democracy in our increasingly networked world through smartly designed systems that structure for participation. Well, I'm about to ask first Audrey and then Geoff to outline their thoughts on today's exam question. That is, digital democracy, how can digital technology facilitate citizens' voices in policymaking? This will begin a conversation between myself, Audrey and Geoff initially, and then with the wider group participating in the seminar. But first, Audrey, the floor is yours.
Sure. Really happy to be here virtually. And to me, democracy is a technology. It's a social technology that we deploy efficiently, hopefully, to create more open and more inclusive systems at scale. And in Taiwan, because we're a really young democracy, the transition from military rule following the Cold War, we only had our first presidential election in 1996, which is after the World Web. And so in Taiwan, we experiment constantly with democracy itself to make sure that decentralized governance, distributed intelligence, and collective co-creation are deployed in the platforms such as the Join, the GOV, the TW platform that you just mentioned, that counts more than half of the country's 24 million citizens. And so the more tangible results, including, for example, our COVID deaths in the single digits without lockdowns. For example, our lightning fast response to digital misinformation or disinformation, what we call the humor over rumor, fighting the infodemic with no administrative takedowns, and also a lot of open source technical solutions that can affect, for example, the common sensing of the climate situation or even transport regulation. One of the more often cited example of the GovZero or G0V project that we deployed in 2015 is called V Taiwan, where we ask people how they feel instead of what they suggest about the Uber so-called sharing economy platform. And very interestingly, when people have access to the sort of pro-social media rather than anti-social media, I'll not name names, people actually see a lot more in common with each other. See, in the police system, you can see one single citizen's feeling. For example, I feel passenger liability insurance is very important, which you can agree or disagree. If you press agree, you move toward people who agree. And if you disagree, you move toward people who disagree with that statement. And then you see another feeling from another citizen and then agree or disagree. Notably missing, though, is a reply button. So there's no way for trolls to grow. By deploying such systems consistently for multi-sectoral conversations, we always find at the end of the 3 week or so, the ideological statements such as what's sharing economy, is ride sharing, or is time sharing also sharing. People agree to disagree on these parts. But the far more are the consensus statements that people have a rough consensus on the registration, on not undercutting existing meters, and things like that, on insurance and so on. So we use those collective intelligence mandated agenda as the agenda to communicate in a multi-stakeholder forum. And then nowadays, Uber and Uber Eats are locally registered companies and taxi fleets. And they also make sure that there's also like Line Taxi and other taxi companies and co-ops that can benefit from this updated regulation without undercutting one another, because people understand the whole picture in a more holistic way. And then it can overturn existing power structures and hierarchies, because people understand that this is actually the rough consensus of everyone, including Uber drivers and taxi drivers, and the existing structure that is predicated on the binary thinking or zero-sum thinking are very difficult to deploy when people have a more holistic understanding of the situation. Now, VTaiwan would go and process many other policy-making features, but I would stop here and simply say that if we think democracy itself as a technology, we will not be limited to just uploading 3 bits per 4 years. Every person is called voting, by the way, but would also focus on more day-to-day response systems. And I'll just stop here so that Geoff and you have more to contribute.
Okay, lovely phrase, 3 bits every 4 years. Yes, Geoff, over to you.
Yeah, so I mean, I think it's worth saying that this debate of what digital can mean for democracy has been underway for probably 60 years, 50, 60 years. Back in the 60s, there was a lot of discussion then of push button democracy on cable, a kind of assumption representative democracy would be replaced by direct. I think all the more recent initiatives try to combine them rather than seeing them as pure alternatives. And that's been true through the addition of things like petition sites, which we had in number 10, the many initiatives in cities to allow citizens to propose ideas, to comment, to vote, and also parliaments beginning to open themselves up so people can take part digitally as citizens, not just representatives, and so on. And as Audrey said, using a succession of technologies from, again, cable originally, through the internet now to AI, helping to shape debates and show you where you sit in a landscape of views. So I just want to make very briefly sort of 3 initial comments. One is, I think, a really important one, which we often get a bit wrong. Democracy is not a single thing. It's not just majority vote. it's actually an assembly of often quite contradictory elements. If you look at almost any real democracy, it has different institutions with different voting principles. There'll be courts, there'll be civil society, there'll be the media. And a lesson again and again of recent years is it's not just having an election every 4 years. That is not a real democracy. It's an assembly, and every part of that assembly can be changed by digital. Secondly, in terms of what that digital then does, I think there are two different angles to it. One is citizen voice in terms of people being able to say what they care about, to express themselves not just every 4 or 5 years with 3 bits. And that is hugely important because people do care about all sorts of issues and don't just want to delegate all their power to Parliament, but also expertise. On almost any topic, there'll be enormous expertise around society, which is often superior to what's in the heads of MPs or civil servants. And many of these tools are being used to tap into that kind of broader intelligence. And then finally, just COVID. Obviously, the last 10 months has dramatically accelerated digitization of so many things, from education in schools to retailing. And it has actually forced a faster change in parliaments in particular than anything else. So the British Parliament was totally resistant to most digital tools, but of necessity, because of social distancing, they had to allow MPs to take part in debates online. And to give credit, things like the Parliamentary Office of Science and Technology have used the crisis to bring in thousands of people to offer their expertise to decision making in a way that had never been done before. And very, very final point, in some places like Oregon in the US are using digital tools to help organize a wider conversation about how we build out of the crisis, how we build back better, a more inclusive recovery. That's not yet happening in the UK, but you never know, it might do.
Right. So those were extremely interesting opening comments. Could I just try and provoke both of you, though, a little bit now? Presumably, there's quite a paternalistic aspect to the way in which the interchanges are controlled. I mean, it's clear that one wants to somehow control misinformation or control some of the downsides of social media as seen in large parts of the world. And you've mentioned, Audrey, that you don't allow the right of reply because that would allow trolling and allow various downsides. And of course, at various points in the architecture of these systems, there are decisions like that. And I just wonder about how those decisions are made. I mean, the technology has always constrained things like representative democracy. I suppose initially sending someone on horseback a few hundred years ago, sending someone on horseback over several days to the assembly or something was essential. The technology of that day forced a form of representative democracy. But if you have push button democracy, isn't there a little bit of a concern that there's a spectrum of how seriously people take it? So at least in the UK, things like Strictly Come Dancing and how people vote for that. I mean, there's a spectrum where at one end you have a kind of almost, there's many things being signaled by a vote other than who's the best dancer. And so similarly in elections, there may be many things signaled, and the electorate may not think very hard about who would be best to govern for 4 years. They may think more about how I convey a certain signal. So the question is, how do you design the architecture? And isn't that a strong element of paternalism in how you design that?
So the police infrastructure is not built by the Taiwan government. It's done by a bunch of ex-occupiers in Seattle as an open source project. And it is not the only system that we learned from in the open source world. There's a strong element, for example, of the petition system that came from Better Reykjavik from Iceland. And again, it is a free software system and offers, for example, whenever in our national petition system, people can post pro and contra opinions and upvote and downvote each other's points. But again, there's no way to reply across the two aisles. So you see these patterns happening again and again, not because any top-down design, but almost by evolution. Like the systems that do, for example, allow for naming names and constant notifications and so on, may be selected for addictiveness, but they do not produce the kind of rough consensus that people would like in the kind of public deliberation. There's a lot of very small things, like the pro and contra are numbered like 131 or so, but it's not proportional. You don't see the green bar growing all the way here just because there's more pro than contra points, because that would basically reward people to spam or to astroturf this comment board and so on. And again, this is not because of top-down design, but because we learned from the best free software discourse systems, such as, well, the one that's called Discourse. And there's many ones like that. So I would say this is more a swarm-like design space. Anyone who designed for online interaction eventually discovered the kind of patterns that encourage more divergent but not polarizing, convergent but not too uniform design patterns. And they just apply, I guess, these design patterns in a way that is more amenable for people to copy. And we literally copied many of those designs in designing our open systems.
Geoff?
Yeah, I agree with all of that. Democracy is a conscious design. It is, in that sense, a technology, and you can choose to design like the US does, having an electoral college, a 2.5-month transition, which made a lot of sense in the late 18th century, makes absolutely no sense today at all. And now I think there are different design issues. So one is truth. It's quite hard to have a functioning democracy without a strong sort of surrounding ecosystem of facts and news and truth. In Finland, they now teach kids much intensively how to spot misinformation, disinformation, malinformation. The rules we've started to see on the platforms during elections to stop again misinformation are part of what I think will be a very dominant theme of the next 10 or 20 years, how to protect the truth and accuracy around democracy. Similarly, as Audrey said, a lot of the detail design, and this comes to detail, has been to try and avoid the worst characteristics of Twitter and so on, which tend to be polarizing, amplifying the loudest but often not representative voices. And Better Reykjavik, which was one of the great pioneers, showed how you could have a debate which in some ways essentially made illegal or illicit those sort of behaviors, and so forced people to attend to the substance, drove towards consensus rather than polarization. But it's all about the detail of design. It's not sort of broad brush abstraction. And then I think there are some other ways in which we can organize democracy which also help. I think it's quite useful sometimes to break it down into multiple stages. It's not a single vote. As you said, Frank, when you vote in an election, there's so many different things coming together. And if you break the stages down into how issues are framed or recognized, how they're diagnosed, how different options are thought about, then how decisions are made, then how they're scrutinized, at each stage you can use digital tools to enhance the process, bring in more intelligence to get a better result. Whereas if everything is compressed into 3-bit, 4 or 5 yearly decisions, it's not surprising. It doesn't feel all that smart. And often people feel their governing systems sort of don't really amplify the intelligence of their society, often the opposite. And the US is, to me, the clearest case right now, a country with more resources of brain power than any nation in history, and yet a governing system which often generates extraordinarily dumb results.
Right. So could I just, for the benefit of us all, it may be worth just illustrating an example of participation that I think is very compelling. And so, Audrey, the example of mask rationing. I mean, I mentioned that Taiwan's highly functional COVID response. There's been several components to that, but one in particular that matches with the current discussion is mask rationing, the way in which the public were engaged in the development of the strategy and of the mechanisms. If you could just describe that, I think it would help us.
Certainly. So it really helps that Taiwan's main collective intelligence systems are already in place, in the sense that we have functional public data and infrastructure for policymaking before the COVID that's truly operated by the social sector, like by the GovZero folks. And for example, a lot of Taiwanese primary schoolers learn data science from this simple thing called an airbox, which measures the PM 2.5 and other data air quality data and share it with the National Center for High-Speed Computing, but also for Academia Sinica and many other distributed ledgers. And so the data set was itself open source, the hardware, open hardware, opening the door for further technical development for the citizens group, for example, that builds water sensors and a water map for water pollutions and many other things. And so when the civil society, the civic hacker community, and the ministries already have such a good like mutual trustworthiness and mutual accountability, then we can build, and we did build last February, a very interesting case called the Mosque Map. And that is not the government technology project. It literally came from just a single civic hacker in Tainan City who decided to crowdsource, that's to say, ask their friends and families to report whether any pharmacy or convenience stores have run out of masks and which ones still have plenty of supply, and display it on an interactive map. And at that point, it's not unlike like OpenStreetMap or Ushahidi or some existing projects, but because he almost gets bankrupted, owing Google 20K US dollars on the second day of this like truly going viral, he sought help on the GovZero community's chat channel. And I was one of the people joining in brainstorming. And so I brought his application to the head of cabinet, our premier, Su Zhenchang, saying we really should trust citizens with real-time open data. In Taiwan, we call it open API. So in February 6th, that's 3 days after he pioneered that use of MAP, there's dozens of civic hacker implementations of where exactly are the mask available pharmacies. And the interesting thing is that you don't have to use any particular implementation. You can use Howard's implementation, which shows the green ones as one that still have some mask available, and yellow ones as being lower on stock, and the red ones being out of stock, and see for yourself where you're queuing in line. People swiping their national health card can see that it actually goes down from 58 to 56, 54, because at the beginning it's 2 masks per week. Nowadays it's 10 per 2 weeks. And people who do not see this going down in real time can just call this hotline 192 to complain about it. But you don't have to use a map. If you prefer chatbots, there's also a very popular chatbot the very same day. And for people with seeing difficulties, there's also voice assistance. All in all, there's more than 100 different tools. And imagine if we publish only every day the total production and consumption of medical grade masks, then people would not have this way of participatory accountability that checks the real-time data while they're queuing in line. The magic happens because people understand that for data quality, just like in measuring air quality and water quality, everyone can actually do their part by holding the measurement devices, and the pharmacists, in this case, the suppliers, to account if there's anything wrong going on. So because of that, we don't have any disinformation and conspiracy theories when it comes to mask shortage or things like that. People waited patiently for a couple of months when we ramp up the production from 2 million a day to 20 million a day. And then eventually we all have sufficient mask being rationed. And so I think the main takeaway is that you don't build this kind of infrastructure overnight with the GovTech and the civic technologists. Some existing mutual accountability mechanism need to exist before the pandemic for this kind of rapid development within literally 72 hours to happen.
Right. And I suppose another aspect that both of you directly and indirectly referred to has been the social sector. So the non-business, non-government organizations of stronger or weaker form that step in and do things. So I wonder if Geoff, you could speak a little bit about that. I mean, what lets a society have a strong social sector? What gives the organizations within the social sector the kind of encouragement and permission to do these things? And then Audrey, if you could describe your experience too of the social sector and what can be done to encourage its flourishing.
So yeah, I think any mature democracy depends on a very lively civil society, which is sometimes challenging parliaments. So Audrey and co, occupied their parliament. Sometimes people take to the streets, as they did in Korea a few years ago, to get rid of a president, or they play a role in filling the gaps the system can't do. And I think we've seen that in the last 20 or 30 years. There's one crucial thing which we haven't mentioned yet, which is if you look at survey evidence, people's confidence in democracy as a system, and particularly young people's confidence, has declined quite sharply in the last 20 or 30 years, compared to a generation now in their 40s, 50s and 60s. And that's in a way paved the way for the rise of authoritarian populists, because, as I say, so many people have lost some faith in the system. Now, civil society in many ways has tried to address that, I think, better than the traditional parties or parliaments. So all the moves to citizens' juries, citizens' assemblies, there's a whole host of democratic innovations have been in play around the world in the last 20 or 30 years, but mainly funded by civil society or foundations, applied to things like bioethics or GM crops, obviously issues of gender and marriage and abortion more recently, and often then governments have come in a bit later. Similarly, if you look at some of the biggest everyday experiments, like in Paris, where there's a very large budget for participatory budgeting, or in Iceland, they're in a way on the boundary between government and civil society, because people can propose a new public park or some improvement to the community, and then citizens can vote on which ones they want or improve them. And I quite like the way those, as it were, have sort of almost reintegrated society into the state. So you can't quite tell where one stops and the other begins. Now, those methods can't be used for issues like monetary policy or very ones requiring hugely detailed expertise. But they do answer, I think, the fundamental reason why faith in democracy has declined, which is people's loss of a feeling of control. That's the heart of it, is people don't feel this system anymore really represents them, gives them the sense of control in a much more minor way they may get when they're shopping or watching entertainment. And the challenge for the current holders of democracy is, what are you going to do if you're not going to use these new methods? What better methods do you have to restore trust and confidence in people who have largely lost it?
Right. So yeah, Audrey.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I would just add to that point. First, that in the curriculum design, the curriculum that we rolled out a couple of years ago in Taiwan actually did away with the word literacy when referring to digital literacy or media literacy. We now call it digital and media competence, meaning that everyone is a producer, not just a consumer, quote unquote, of digital media. And this is literally true in Taiwan with broadband as human right, but also more intentionally, we ask, for example, middle schoolers, even some primary schoolers, to fact check the presidential candidates, 3 of them earlier last year, during their platforms and debates and things like that. So they are part of the newsroom instead of just being taught the media literacy to comprehend what they see on radio and television. They can actively correct presidential candidates when they're wrong, and their fact checking actually have a good partnership to not just online, but also more traditional form of media that can then empower the young citizens so that even before they are of the age to vote, they can already influence meaningfully to the democratic process that's even as bandwidth limited as the presidential vote. And this is not just during the presidential election, but happens all the time with our CoFacts, which is a collaborative fact-checking platform that anyone can highlight. And the expertise that Geoff mentioned is then contacted through, for example, the Taiwan Fact Check Center, which is part of the International Fact-Checking Network, to make sure that all the trending misinformation or disinformation gets rebutted, hopefully within a couple hours.
Okay,
Maybe could I just...
Go ahead, Geoff.
I want to throw in a thought experiment, maybe for others to answer on, since we are now 10 months into the COVID crisis. So CSAP is part of, as it were, our system of trying to orchestrate scientific knowledge, tapping into either dozens or hundreds or thousands of scientists feeding into the SAGE and so on. So just wonder what would have happened if back in March or April, Parliament or the government had created something like a citizens' assembly, a panel, a representative panel from across the UK of citizens to give advice on some of the difficult dilemmas on lockdowns and easing and school reopening. Would they have come up with better recommendations than the cabinet? Now, from what we know of polling on public views, they probably, in retrospect, would have called the key decisions better than the politicians. Now, no one knows, but it's an interesting sort of immediate historical thought experiment. And at the very least, on these sort of dilemmas which do involve daily life, do involve difficult trade-offs of health and economics and so on, at the very least, bringing the public in, probably through a panel rather than through everyone, I think is a way of enhancing democracy and also making the decisions which are then made more legitimate than they have been over the last year or so.
Right. So could I now just, we'll open up to comments from the participants in a moment. And if people want to ask a question, if they could just put it into the chat function, then I'll try to bring you into the conversation. And then you can turn your camera on to ask your question. But just before we go into that, so one of the difficulties, or one of the sort of sharp edges of digitalization and the COVID response and whatever is things concerned with privacy, things concerned with anonymization. And I think it would be interesting, I think, for the audience to hear, Audrey, your description of the mechanisms that you used for contact tracing for things like nightclubs. A very sensitive area involving young people who are digitally competent, but nonetheless may or may not trust to give their details. So do you want to describe how that worked through the COVID crisis in Taiwan?
Yes, certainly. And it's being called by researchers participatory self-surveillance, which sounds a little bit dense. So I will unpack that a little bit. So the point here is that when we are looking at the nightlife district around April last year, we do see a single case that's diagnosed with COVID. And of course, the medical officers interviewed her, but she initially said that she's just staying at home. She doesn't know how she gets contacted with the virus and so on. But on the second day, and finally said that she works at a professional hostess bar as a hostess. And in the nightlife district, it's a norm to keep the privacy details of their patrons, which is why she essentially refused to disclose the whereabouts the first day. Now, the Central Epidemic Command Center, the CECC, were under tremendous pressure to, I don't know, close down the nightlife district, find a business owner. There's many revengeful suggestions being suggested, not only by social media, but also by popular media. But the CECC eventually decided on something else entirely. Instead of fining anyone or putting anyone in prison, which they didn't, they just simply said that the epidemiologic requirement is that we need to go back for 14 days and get the contact details of the person and notify them to report to self-quarantine or home quarantine. So there need to be a reliable way for the real contact to happen, whereas the nightlife district's norm is avoiding of real names. So real contact instead of real names, and the data decentralized at the business owner's place instead of at the central or municipal government's place is going to be the design criteria. And the Minister Chen Shizhong challenged the business of the nightlife district owners to come up with something. And so within a couple of weeks, they did come up with something, which is literally scratch pads. So people who visit their places need to leave at least a throwaway SIM card's contact number or a maybe throwaway email, proton mail or something, but they do not need to register their real name. And they keep that scratch pad only only for 4 weeks. And if there's 4 weeks with no local reported cases, then they just shred the previous pages of that scratchpad, and without having to submit any data or information to the government. And after a couple more weeks consulting with the municipal governments, the CECC said that that's entirely fine. And so after a month or so, the Nightlife District gradually reopened, adopting the real contact system. So I hope this is a good example of a co-creating, like across sectors, norm-based partnership that started again from the social sector, from literally the nightlife workers, hostesses and hosts organizing themselves on the internet and proposing their take on this dilemma, and then the public sector endorse it for the private sector to adhere to.
Okay, thank you. So we'll open up now to questions from participants, and the first one comes from Charlie Kennel. So Charlie, do you want to turn your camera on and unmute yourself and ask your question? Yeah, Charlie, you need to unmute yourself. Charlie, you need to unmute.
That's okay. All right.
Go ahead.
I have a responsibility to the fourth of the and concluding seminar in this series. And the issue, I think, will be something like this. Will what we have learned during the COVID crisis about the treating of health of populations, can we extend it to the health of the planet, given the very different timescales involved, timescales of both action and span, and the global and international dimension of the climate crisis. And the other thing I'm struck by is the recent death about 2 days ago of a person who was effectively a Scripps colleague of mine, Paul Crewson. Paul died. He visited Scripps as much as I visit Cambridge, so almost every year. And Paul was responsible for one of the controlling conceptions in my world, which is the word Anthropocene. And his idea was that human activities would become so intense and so widespread that a future generation of geologists would look upon the Earth and notice that this was the era in which human behavior determined the health of the planet, the face of the planet, the survival of the species, the structure of the biodiversity structure, and the environmental health. So there's a corollary to the Crewson thesis, which is that, and this is where I think you come in, what we think and how we think as a global society is materialized about a generation later in what our children and grandchildren see. And so all this discussion about digital democracy and connectivity actually has a very deep implication if we're going to deal with the Anthropocene crisis to come, which is 40, 50 years off. So the question I have is that the tools that you have discovered and looked at, do you see them being generalized and globalized to the great extent that on a decadal or so timescale, you can arrive at a global consensus that will, in fact, lead to a concatenation, a collection of actions that will preserve our climate and environment? Do you see these tools working at that scale?
So I'll ask Audrey first and then Geoff. So go ahead, Charlie's challenging question.
Sure. And to me, it's a very optimistic yes, because most of our GovZero projects do have an international collaboration and appeal. And the very first GovZero projects, as I mentioned, are Mosque Rationing, which is a flagship counter-pandemic civic tech tool, did actually start as a modification of the environmental sensing network. And the PM 2.5 sensing is just one part of a more larger, what we call civil IoT system. And I'll just type the address here in the chat so that people can check it out themselves. But the civil IoT system at CI, Taiwan GOVTW, as well as the presidential hackathon, the top 5 winners, which all get the presidential mandate to implement their ideas as policy. That's our hackathon prize. So 5 every year. I would say all of them are related to climate change in one way or the other, including reducing the use of plastic, including encouraging more smarter meter usage of electricity and appliances, including imagining planting plants together in the previously unused lands, and many more. And also to, I guess, adapt by getting push notifications whenever there's heat damage possibly going on in the neighborhood that is contrary to what people used to think could be the days that are very hot, and so on. So all these, all the way from the prevention to the mitigation, are on the table of the civic tech scene in Taiwan, and many of them do already have international counterparts, as well as working like internationally, like with the Open Contracting Partnership and the Open Government Partnership, which are also refocusing on more environmental issues starting last year.
So shall I turn this? I think this is a great question, and certainly animating me quite a lot at the moment. So one thing which we've seen in the COVID crisis is countries like Taiwan, which have put in place much more sophisticated shared intelligence systems, have generally done better. That's to say, the capacity to observe what is happening, infections, contacts, etc., the capacity to respond very quickly to everything from misinformation to the need for quarantines, and others are well behind. And for me, exactly comparable methods will be needed for decarbonisation and climate change. We need a step change in our ability to observe carbon emissions down to building level, streets and so on. We need much better orchestration of knowledge about what is effective, what isn't effective, etc., etc. And I'll put in the chat a much longer piece on this. But it does also link to democracy. There's a global aspect to this. How do we evolve an IPCC, which is mainly there for diagnosis, into beyond the Paris Agreement shared prescription on what to be done? And there's a democratic aspect right down to the neighborhood level. How do neighborhoods work together on what they can do to cut emissions street by street, neighborhood by neighborhood? So I think these do link up. There's a much bigger, almost philosophical issue behind your question of the Anthropocene, where I think we need new political theories which really give weight to ecosystems and knowledge systems, and so aren't just about human sovereignty. Everything we've been talking about is human sovereignty, but that would require another day, another seminar, not for now, I think.
Charlie, do you want to come back with a quick comment?
Yeah, well, first of all, will we have one day an automated environmental management system, which will be a system of sensors and built-in decision-making that the society can agree on? But the larger question, I think, I would phrase this way. You know, a world came to an end, but the world of the nation state came to an end with the First World War. But before that, at a smaller scale, some of the European countries developed a unified culture of governance, religion, technology, and so forth. And they arrived at a cultural identity which enabled them to reach, within their societies, enable them to reach a degree of governability. And I think the question is, if we apply these tools and the ways that we're talking together now, and the consensus forming tools that you've been discussing, will we be able to do that on a global scale? Or in trying to do that, will we set off a number of instabilities, such as the ones we are seeing? And I think that's the question. Can we end up with a unitary, at least in the area of preservation of the environment and the climate change, can we end up with a sufficiently unitary global culture of thought and action that will actually get the job done?
Well, I guess the participatory nature of the social sector is an interesting model to think of generalizing to from within a society to between societies or between governments and between populations.
Yeah, with the forces of convergence of the local, the regional, and the global actually win out over the forces of divergence that are also.
That's a question for the next decades. But if Geoff or Audrey want to come in.
Well, yeah. Just a very, very quick one. I think there was a time when people imagined global governance in terms of a scaling up of national. So there would be an assembly, there'd be a world army, a World Bank, a world, council, etc. Again, there's not time here. I'm putting in the chat a much longer answer to your question, which says that's the wrong metaphor. We need to think in quite different ways, much more networked ways, about global collaboration on knowledge, on information, but also on action, rather than a singular answer, which probably isn't very plausible and probably isn't very desirable either. But anyway, this piece I will share is intended to prompt debate.
Yeah, we should have a discussion offline about that too. Yeah.
Audrey, do you want to come back?
Yeah, again, a very short comment. I think more than 1/4 of our e-petitions, our national petition system, are from school children. So people who are below 18 years old, often just 14 or 15 years old. And the thing they petition for is not just for Taiwanese young people, right? They petition for example, banning plastic straws, for example, putting a cap on the total carbon emissions and so on. They propose, for example, this jacket I'm wearing is made from recycled plastic and coffee bean waste and so on. It's the circular economy, and they petition a lot of that as well. And so there's a very discernible thread that if you use, even just for this generation, the participatory democracy tools that enable very young people like 12 or 13 years old, there's a very strong global and planetary sense in the things that they petition for. So there's every reason to be optimistic.
So I'll bring in the next question now, or next comment to the discussion, and that's from Teresa Marto, one of the organizers of the whole series. So Teresa, do you want to turn your camera on and ask your question or make a comment?
Thank you very much, Frank. And first of all, I'd like to thank both Audrey and Geoff and yourself, Frank, for a really stimulating discussion thus far. So thank you, all of you. I think that Audrey and Geoff are eloquent exponents of a continuum, if you like, of digital democracy. So we can think of Taiwan at one end and the UK at another end. And Geoff has given us an interesting thought experiment. If in the UK, which I think is probably well characterised by the 3-bit per 4-year democracy at the moment, if we had citizens' assemblies or a more open form of engaging citizens, would our response to COVID have been different? So I leave that hanging there, but I would be really interested in comments from both Audrey and Geoff on, given where we are in the UK, given our ambition to build back better, fairer, greener, where would you start in trying to build what Audrey has described already as that extraordinary history that you have in Taiwan of a mutual trust, engagement of citizens and government, so that in the UK we can begin what is an ambition to do better? Thank you.
So let me ask Geoff first, as he knows the UK situation a bit better, to respond first of all.
Well, precisely because democracy is many things at many levels, I think there are many answers to your question. Some of the easiest ones are at a local level, in local government or cities, where there's now a lot of experience of how you open up decision making. And it's easiest to start on things which are issues about public spaces, for example, and improvements. And just in parenthesis there, the Paris programme, linking to what Audrey just said, also allocated a certain amount of money for school children to decide how it should be spent, so they would learn the habits of democracy earlier. It's very sad we haven't managed to do that in any of the UK's big cities. Scotland, Wales and Northern Ireland, again, are good scales for using some of these tools, probably starting off with particular topics run by parliaments rather than governments, where there isn't a consensus. And then I hope we can see some national level use of these tools. DCMS, to be fair, was beginning to fund various digital democracy experiments before the crisis hit. And I think around some of the dilemmas of the recovery would be an ideal place for an ambitious forward-looking government to say it was going to open up the space for proposals, for deliberation, and then for decision on how we use the recovery to actually solve some of the deeper long-term problems the country faces, rather than just going back to where we were before.
So Audrey, in your answer, I wonder if you'd spend a little bit of time reflecting on things that you think, if you'd known something earlier when you did it in Taiwan, might you have done it differently? Were there hurdles and difficulties that you didn't anticipate, but with the experience that you've now had, you could give that advice to other countries?
Certainly. So one of the main learnings as a digital minister, as compared to as just a hacktivist, now a minister / hacktivist, I think the main learning is that the career public service are the most innovative people that I have ever known. But outside of the cabinets or outside of the public service, because of this culture of public service being anonymous, it's very difficult for people in the social sector to see just exactly how innovative career public service is. So if I had known this earlier, I'll probably roll out things like the presidential hackathon, which rewards public service individuals to act with the social sector to propose something quite crazy. And if it doesn't work, they can remain pseudonymous or even anonymous, saying I'm just attending a hackathon. But if it works, then it gets promoted by the president and their career changes. I'll probably roll out this kind of more intrapreneurship programs earlier on, because previously I didn't know that there's just so many ideas just waiting to be implemented within the career public service.
Okay, right. Thank you. So, Teresa, did you want to come back quickly, or?
I just very quick comment, picking up on what Geoff said. I think engaging school children, when we think about the intergenerational justice issues, both in terms of climate change and also in terms of the devastation of the pandemic, where it's been affecting older people more, but it's the young people whose lives are being most adversely affected. So I think that's really very important. I think also coordination. So I want to give a shout out for ONS, the Office for National Statistics in the UK, well, in England, who've been brilliant in terms of generating data, but actually being able to pull all that together, I think, is the next big step. Thanks very much.
Yeah. Right. Can I just pick up on that? Because I totally agree. ONS has had a good year. Not many bits of government have. And I would love to see the use of challenges as a way to motivate democracy. So that at a city level, the challenge would be, what can you do to cut carbon emissions, let's say by 50% in the next 10 years? Get the school kids involved, use these to generate creative problem solving as well as just expression of voice. And then make sure there's some money to put some of those into practice. And there's a whole host of issues which I think are amenable to both improving our ability to solve problems and re-energizing democracy, so people feel experience control and that their intelligence is being tapped into.
Yeah, there's a lovely challenge, of course, for the education sector. I mean, I love that phrase of Audrey's, data competence, not literacy. I mean, literacy does look like a one-way communication. You read stuff. Data competence both ways. So that'll be my particular little message to take back to one part of the world. Okay, we have to stop in about 2 minutes. So I think there's simply time for a few last thoughts from Audrey first, and then Geoff, and then we'll close.
If I only have 1 minute, I always read my job description. So I might as well read my job description. It's kind of a way to challenge both current and next generations to think beyond the metaphors of ICT, information and communication technology, which connects machines, and rather to digital, which connects people. So my job description goes like this. When we see the Internet of Things, let's make it an Internet of beings. When we see virtual reality, let's make it shared reality. When we see machine learning, let's make it collaborative learning. When we see user experience, let's make it about human experience. And whenever we hear that the singularity is near, let us always remember the plurality is here.
Thank you, Audrey. Geoff?
So I'll be much less poetic, I'm afraid. 3 points. So one is, we saw only a few weeks ago how fragile democracy can be in Washington. And if democracy isn't continually improved and re-energized, it risks falling backwards and stagnating. Almost everything we now do is part digital as well as part offline. That's true of our education, our health, our entertainment, our interactions with friends and family. So it'd be astonishing if the same wasn't true of democracy. But in recent years, it's required outsiders to bring these insights into democracy. People like Audrey, who literally had to occupy the parliament. And all over the world, nearly all the experiments have come from outsiders, not from the incumbents. So I think the main thing we have to sort of push for is the people who are the beneficiaries of the old system, in the big parties, in government, in parliament, they have to become a little bit more like the outsider insurgents. Otherwise, we risk seeing our democracy slipping back, and it's probably the most valuable thing we possess as a society. So that would be a true tragedy.
Right. So, I mean, this seminar series is an extremely ambitious one, and I did wonder whether we would be disappointed or saddened that it was too big. But I think from both Audrey and Geoff, we've had an inspiring presentations, and I think we can look forward with a little bit more optimism to the future. So, on behalf of all of our participants, can I thank Audrey and Geoff for taking part and for being so inspiring. Thank you.